Why is Vanessa sitting in my seat? I asked quietly at the dinner table while everyone suddenly avoided looking at me. My daughter-in-law smiled gently before answering. Oh, Eleanor, we just thought it made more sense this way now. My son nodded without hesitation. I stood there for a moment holding the bowl of roasted potatoes while something inside me shifted so silently that nobody else even noticed it breaking. I am glad you are here. Stay with me until the end and tell me where you are watching from, because sometimes strangers understand these quiet betrayals better than family ever does. Sunday dinners used to belong to me. For 34 years, the Whitmore family gathered around the same oak dining table inside the Connecticut house my husband Charles and I spent most of our lives building together. Every holiday recipe, every birthday cake, every candlelit Christmas dinner passed through my hands first. Charles used to joke that nobody entered our home without smelling cinnamon, rosemary, or fresh bread somewhere in the air. The dining room was always the heart of our family, and for decades, I sat at the head of the table beside him while our son Daniel laughed too loudly over football stories and little Sophie dropped peas onto the carpet beneath her chair. Back then, family felt natural, warm, uncomplicated. But warmth changes slowly when the wrong person learns how to control it. Vanessa Whitmore entered our lives 8 years ago wearing pearl earrings, elegant beige coats, and the kind of polished smile that immediately made other women compliment her manners. She never raised her voice, never openly insulted anyone. That was what made her dangerous. Vanessa understood how to erase people quietly enough that by the time they noticed, everyone else already accepted the new version of reality. At first, the changes seemed harmless. Different Thanksgiving decorations, new Christmas recipes, rearranged furniture in the living room. Daniel always explained it gently. Vanessa just wants to modernize things a little, Mom. Modernize. Such an innocent word for replacing someone piece by piece. The dining room looked beautiful that evening. Vanessa had decorated the table with gold candles, eucalyptus branches, and linen napkins folded into perfect little triangles beside each plate. Snow drifted softly outside the tall windows while jazz music played low through hidden speakers somewhere near the kitchen. Sophie sat beside the fireplace coloring snowflakes while Daniel poured wine into crystal glasses Vanessa insisted looked more sophisticated than the older set Charles and I collected together over 30 years of marriage. I stood near the kitchen doorway carrying the potatoes when I realized my usual chair at the head of the table was gone. Not moved slightly, gone completely. In its place sat Vanessa, elegant and composed, already unfolding her napkin across her lap while directing Sophie where to place the salad bowls. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. The silence itself answered my question before anyone even spoke. Why is Vanessa sitting in my seat? I finally asked softly. Daniel looked uncomfortable immediately, but Vanessa smiled with calm confidence. Oh, Eleanor, she said lightly. You always spend the whole dinner getting up for things anyway. We thought this arrangement might feel easier for you. Easier for me. Another careful sentence designed to sound thoughtful while quietly removing me from my own place inside the family. Daniel cleared his throat and nodded. It really does make more sense this way, Mom. Mom, not your chair. Not, we should have asked you first. Just practical agreement delivered quickly so nobody needed to sit inside the discomfort too long. I placed the potatoes onto the table carefully before sitting farther down near the end beside Sophie's empty schoolbooks. The chair felt unfamiliar beneath me, smaller somehow, like sitting at someone else's family dinner instead of my own. Throughout the meal, Vanessa guided every conversation effortlessly. She reminded Daniel about Sophie's piano recital schedule, discussed upcoming neighborhood charity events, and corrected little details about family stories before I could finish telling them myself. Actually, she interrupted smoothly at one point. That vacation happened in Vermont, not Maine. Charles would have laughed hearing that because he took photographs during that trip with giant signs reading Bar Harbor behind us the entire week. But Daniel simply nodded toward his wife. Right, Vermont. I looked down quietly at my untouched wine glass while candlelight flickered softly across the polished oak table Charles built with his own hands during the winter of 1996. I suddenly realized something painful then. Vanessa was not trying to become part of this family anymore. She was slowly becoming the version of the family everyone else adjusted themselves around. Halfway through dinner, little Sophie looked up innocently from her plate. Mommy says someday this will be her dining room completely. The room fell silent instantly. Daniel froze beside his wine glass, while Vanessa's smile flickered for only half a second before returning perfectly into place. Sophie, she said gently, finish your vegetables. But my heartbeat had already begun climbing painfully inside my chest. Because sitting there beneath the warm dining room lights while snow covered the quiet Connecticut streets outside, I understood something terrifying at last. The most dangerous people are not the ones who steal loudly. They are the ones who replace you slowly while everyone keeps smiling at the table. After dinner ended that evening, I remained alone in the dining room long after Daniel and Vanessa carried dessert plates into the kitchen. The candles had already burned halfway down into uneven pools of wax across the gold holders Vanessa bought from some expensive boutique in Manhattan. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the backyard where Charles once built wooden sled ramps for Daniel every winter when he was little. I sat quietly in the unfamiliar chair near the far end of the table while the grandfather clock ticked steadily near the staircase. For the first time in 34 years, I no longer felt like the woman who belonged at the center of this house. And perhaps the most painful part was how naturally everyone else seemed to accept it. I could hear Vanessa laughing softly in the kitchen while directing Daniel where to place leftovers inside the refrigerator. Not on the top shelf, she said lightly. Sophie's lunches go there now. Small sentence. Ordinary sentence. Yet lately, every ordinary moment carried the strange feeling that my life was slowly being edited around me. Charles used to call this house my kingdom as a joke whenever holiday chaos filled every room at once. Nobody rules a dining table like Eleanor Whitmore. He would laugh while stealing pieces of turkey before Thanksgiving guests arrived. Back then, Daniel still looked at me with warmth untouched by hesitation. Back then, traditions were not something people replaced. They were something families protected together. I rose slowly from the chair and began clearing plates myself, even though Vanessa insisted earlier that older women should stop overworking during gatherings. Another careful sentence disguised as kindness. As I carried dishes toward the kitchen sink, I noticed something strange near the hallway entrance. The framed family photograph that usually hung beside the staircase was gone. My chest tightened immediately. That photograph had been there for nearly 20 years. Charles standing beside me during our 35th anniversary party. Daniel beside us wearing a navy suit. Little Sophie as a baby in my arms. I stared at the empty wall hook for several quiet seconds before hearing Vanessa behind me. Oh, she said smoothly, noticing my expression. I moved that old frame upstairs yesterday. Old frame. Not family photograph. Not memory. Just another object quietly removed from the center of the house. Why? I asked softly. Vanessa dried her hands carefully with a dish towel before answering. The living room needed a cleaner look. Cleaner. Another innocent word carrying something colder underneath it. Daniel walked into the kitchen, then holding empty wine glasses. Vanessa has really good instincts with design, he said casually. The house honestly feels more updated lately. Updated. Modernized. Cleaner. I noticed how often those words appeared whenever pieces of my life disappeared from common spaces inside this home. Vanessa smiled warmly at him before touching his arm gently. I was actually thinking we could turn the upstairs sitting room into a home office too. I looked up immediately because the upstairs sitting room had belonged to Charles. His reading chair still sat beside the window overlooking the maple trees. His books remained stacked beside the fireplace exactly where he left them before the heart attack took him 2 years ago. Charles spent every evening in that room, I said quietly. Vanessa's expression softened into practiced sympathy. I know, but keeping spaces frozen in grief forever is not healthy either. Frozen in grief. Strange how preserving memories suddenly became emotional weakness whenever it inconvenienced her plans. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Maybe we should not discuss renovations tonight. Renovations. They were already discussing changes to rooms I still emotionally lived inside every day. Sophie suddenly ran into the kitchen wearing fuzzy socks and holding one of her school books against her chest. Grandma, she asked brightly, Mom says we might repaint your bedroom too. What color do you want? Silence dropped heavily across the kitchen. Vanessa looked almost annoyed for half a second before recovering instantly. Sophie, she said gently. That conversation was private, but the damage was already done. I stared at my son while cold pressure spread slowly through my chest. Repaint my bedroom? Daniel would not meet my eyes immediately. Instead, he busied himself placing glasses beside the sink like a nervous teenager avoiding consequences. Mom, he finally said carefully. Vanessa and I were only discussing possibilities for the future. Possibilities for the future. Another phrase people use when they are already emotionally committed to decisions they hope sound negotiable later. I leaned one hand against the kitchen counter because suddenly the room felt strangely unsteady beneath me. Future for who? Neither of them answered right away. Sophie looked confused beside the refrigerator while snow tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Finally, Vanessa stepped closer, calm and elegant as always. Eleanor, she said softly, families evolve. Houses evolve too. I looked directly at her then. Really looked at her. The pearl earrings. The polished hair. The carefully measured smile that never quite reached her eyes whenever family history became inconvenient. And at last I understood something deeply unsettling. Vanessa was not trying to destroy me. Destruction is loud, emotional, obvious. What she wanted was far quieter than that. She wanted to replace me so completely that eventually nobody would even notice I had once been the woman holding this family together at all. The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the sound of rain tapping softly against the bedroom windows. Connecticut winters always carried a certain kind of silence after storms, the kind that made large houses feel even larger once everyone else disappeared into their own lives. I remained lying in bed for several minutes, staring at the pale gray ceiling while memories from dinner replayed slowly through my mind. Vanessa sitting in my chair. Daniel agreeing without hesitation. Sophie innocently talking about repainting my bedroom like it was already someone else's decision to make. Strange how families can break your heart without ever raising their voices. Downstairs, the house smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish. I wrapped myself in Charles's navy cardigan and moved slowly through the quiet kitchen while morning rain blurred the backyard beyond the windows. For decades, this room belonged to me in ways nobody needed to explain. I knew exactly where every serving dish sat, which cabinet door stuck during humid weather, how long the old oven needed before baking evenly. But lately, even the kitchen felt different. More staged somehow. Vanessa had replaced my floral curtains with sleek cream linen panels last spring because she claimed the room needed more natural elegance. She reorganized the spice shelves alphabetically, swapped my ceramic cookie jars for minimalist glass containers. Small changes, reasonable changes. Yet each one quietly removed another fingerprint of my life from the home Charles and I built together. While waiting for coffee to brew, I noticed something sitting near the fruit bowl on the counter. A leather-bound notebook I did not recognize. Curious, I opened it. Slowly. Inside were pages of Vanessa's handwriting. Holiday schedules. Seating arrangements. Grocery planning. At first glance, everything looked harmless. Organized even. But then certain phrases caught my attention immediately. Eleanor tends to repeat stories during gatherings. Keep conversations moving before guests become uncomfortable. Daniel should host Thanksgiving toast moving forward. My stomach tightened painfully. She was not simply organizing dinners. She was restructuring roles inside the family itself. Slowly, deliberately, one careful adjustment at a time. I turned another page. Replace old family photos in downstairs hallway with updated portraits. Another page. Transition Sophie toward newer traditions early. Transition. Replace. Update. Every word sounded less like family planning and more like corporate restructuring. Suddenly, footsteps approached from upstairs. I closed the notebook immediately just as Vanessa entered the kitchen wearing silk pajamas beneath a cream cardigan. She paused the second she saw me holding it. For one brief moment, something sharp flashed behind her eyes before her smile returned perfectly into place. "You are up early," she said lightly. I placed the notebook carefully back onto the counter. I could not sleep. Vanessa moved gracefully toward the coffee machine and reached for a mug without appearing nervous at all. That composure unsettled me more than anger ever could have. Most people become defensive when confronted unexpectedly. Vanessa simply adapted. "I hope Sophie did not upset you last night," she said softly while pouring coffee. Children repeat things without understanding context. I studied her quietly across the kitchen island. "And what exactly is the context of repainting my bedroom?" Vanessa stirred cream into her coffee slowly before answering. Daniel and I eventually want this house to function better for everyone. Function better. There it was again. Language designed to sound practical while quietly removing emotional ownership from the conversation. This house functioned perfectly for 40 years before you arrived, I replied calmly. Vanessa smiled faintly over the rim of her mug. Times change, Eleanor. Eleanor. Not Mom. Not anything affectionate. Just my name delivered with polished distance. Rain continued sliding down the kitchen windows while silence settled heavily between us. Finally, Vanessa leaned lightly against the counter and spoke again. You know, she said gently, Daniel worries about you more than he admits. I frowned slightly. Why? Because you seem resistant to moving forward after Charles. There it was. The real accusation hidden beneath all the politeness. According to Vanessa, preserving memory meant emotional weakness. Grief became something embarrassing if it lasted inconveniently long. I love my husband, I answered quietly. That is not resistance. That is loyalty. Vanessa's expression barely shifted. Sometimes loyalty to the past prevents families from evolving. Evolving. Another carefully selected word. As though replacing traditions somehow counted as progress instead of erasure. Before I could answer, Daniel entered the kitchen adjusting his tie while checking emails on his phone. Morning, he muttered distractedly before kissing Vanessa lightly on the cheek. Then he looked toward the counter. Oh good, you found Vanessa's planning notebook. Found. Not read accidentally. Found. Vanessa gave him a small warning glance, but Daniel missed it completely. Honestly, Mom, he continued casually, Vanessa keeps this family running smoothly. Something cold settled quietly inside my chest hearing those words. Keeps this family running smoothly. As though my 34 years holding birthdays, holidays, illnesses, celebrations, grief, and traditions together had somehow become invisible the second another woman organized the seating chart better. Daniel finally looked up from his phone and noticed my silence. What? He asked uncertainly. I stared at my son standing beside the woman slowly redesigning every emotional corner of this house, while rain darkened the windows behind them. Then I realized something heartbreaking at last. Vanessa was not replacing me because she hated me. She was replacing me because Daniel had slowly allowed himself to forget who held this family together long before she arrived. 3 days later, Vanessa hosted the annual Whitmore Winter Charity Gala at the country club downtown. For 26 years before Charles passed away, I organized that event myself. Every centerpiece, every donor list, every handwritten invitation once moved through my hands before reaching anyone else. Charles used to stand beside me greeting guests near the ballroom entrance while Daniel carried auction forms between tables as a teenager wearing oversized tuxedos that never fit properly. The event always belonged to our family, or at least I believed it did. That evening, snow covered the sidewalks outside the country club, while warm golden lights glowed through tall ballroom windows overlooking the frozen golf course. I arrived wearing the navy velvet dress Charles loved because despite everything happening lately, some small part of me still hoped family traditions carried enough memory to protect themselves. Inside, the ballroom looked elegant in the polished way Vanessa preferred. White roses instead of the deep red arrangements I always used during winter events. Modern jazz instead of the old piano trio Charles hired every year. Minimalist table settings replacing the gold candle holders that once reflected warmth across the room. Beautiful. Expensive. Emotionally empty. Guests moved gracefully through the ballroom, carrying champagne glasses, while waiters passed silver trays beneath crystal chandeliers overhead. The moment I entered, several longtime family friends approached warmly. Eleanor. One woman smiled, hugging me gently. It feels strange seeing this event without Charles. I nodded softly. It feels strange for me too. Then before I could say anything else, another guest interrupted brightly. But Vanessa has done such an incredible job modernizing everything. Modernizing again. That word followed me everywhere now like a polite little funeral for the life I once recognized. Across the ballroom, Vanessa stood near the stage wearing an elegant ivory gown while speaking effortlessly with donors and city officials. She looked radiant beneath the lights. Confident. Admired. People gravitated toward her naturally because Vanessa understood something powerful about appearances. If you control the atmosphere, eventually people stop questioning who originally built the room. Daniel stood beside her smiling politely while adjusting auction paperwork in his hands. I watched Vanessa touch his arm lightly during conversations, guiding introductions, finishing details before he spoke them himself. It no longer looked like marriage. It looked like management. During cocktail hour, I wandered slowly through the silent auction displays near the ballroom wall, where photographs from previous charity galas were arranged chronologically across black velvet boards. My chest tightened immediately. The older photographs featuring Charles and me had been moved toward the far back corner, partially hidden behind newer, oversized portraits of Vanessa greeting guests beside Daniel. I stared at the display quietly while cold pressure spread through my chest. 26 years reduced to a side section people would barely notice. The newer layout flows better visually, Vanessa's voice said softly behind me. I turned slowly. She stood holding a champagne glass with perfect posture as always. The board felt cluttered before. Cluttered. Another word for inconvenient history. Those photographs documented decades of this family's work. I replied quietly. Vanessa smiled gently. And now the event is entering a new era. New era. Not continuation. Replacement. Before I could answer, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly, signaling the beginning of speeches. Guests moved toward their tables, while soft applause echoed through the room. Vanessa stepped gracefully onto the stage beside the podium, while Daniel remained near the front row. Good evening, everyone. She began smoothly, voice warm and practiced. Tonight we celebrate not only generosity, but family legacy. Legacy. Interesting word coming from someone carefully rewriting ours. Vanessa continued speaking confidently about community partnerships, charity expansion, and bringing the Whitmore Foundation into a more modern future. The audience applauded enthusiastically several times throughout her speech. Then came the sentence that changed something permanently inside me. When I married Daniel, Vanessa said, smiling beneath the ballroom lights, I realized this family needed a new heart to guide it into the future. The audience applauded warmly. Someone near the front table even whispered loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. She really became the heart of this family. My stomach dropped instantly. I looked toward Daniel expecting discomfort. Correction. Anything. Instead, my son simply smiled proudly toward his wife while applauding with everyone else. That moment hurt more than losing my seat at the dinner table. Because seats can be moved accidentally. This was something deeper. Public. Symbolic. Vanessa was no longer quietly replacing my role behind closed doors. She was being celebrated for it openly while I sat alone at table 14 beside people politely pretending not to notice my silence. After the speech ended, applause filled the ballroom again while Vanessa stepped down gracefully from the stage. Several guests gathered immediately around her offering congratulations and praise. I remained seated beneath the chandelier lights, staring down at the untouched champagne beside my plate while memories surfaced one after another inside my mind. Charles carrying auction boxes through snowstorms. Daniel helping me tape centerpieces together at midnight before events. Years of handwritten donor letters stacked across our kitchen table every winter. Decades of work, sacrifice, and family devotion slowly fading into background decoration while another woman stood at the center receiving credit for warmth she never built herself. Then suddenly an older man seated across from me leaned closer and smiled kindly. You should be proud, he said softly. Vanessa really stepped beautifully into your place. Into your place. Not beside me. Not helping me. Into my place. I smiled politely because dignity sometimes becomes the only thing older women are allowed to keep once people begin taking everything else quietly. But deep inside, something finally became terrifyingly clear. Vanessa did not simply want influence inside this family. She wanted ownership of the emotional legacy Charles and I spent an entire lifetime building together. 2 mornings after the charity gala, Sophie came to stay with me while Vanessa attended meetings in New York and Daniel worked downtown. Snow had finally stopped falling, leaving the Whitmore house wrapped in that strange winter brightness where sunlight reflects sharply across untouched lawns and frozen tree branches. Sophie sat at the kitchen island eating blueberry pancakes while humming softly to herself and swinging her legs beneath the stool Charles built for her when she was 5 years old. Watching her there almost hurt because children preserve innocence in ways adults slowly forget how to protect. Grandma, she asked suddenly between bites, why do you not come downstairs as much anymore? I smiled faintly while pouring syrup beside her plate. I live downstairs every day, sweetheart. Sophie shook her head immediately. Not really. I paused. What do you mean? She frowned thoughtfully the way children do when trying to explain truths adults usually avoid saying aloud. Mom says you like staying by yourself now because too much noise confuses you. The syrup bottle nearly slipped from my hand. I set it down carefully beside the pancakes while cold pressure spread through my chest. Confuses you. Such a small sentence. Yet something about hearing it spoken in Sophie's innocent voice felt devastating in a way far crueler than open insults ever could. Does your mother say that often? I asked quietly. Sophie shrugged. Sometimes. Then she added softly. She tells Daddy not to overwhelm you with family decisions because older people get stressed easier. Older people. Not Grandma. Not Eleanor. Just a category slowly separated from the rest of the family itself. I turned toward the kitchen window before Sophie could notice the expression on my face. Outside, sunlight shimmered across the frozen backyard where Daniel once learned how to skate holding Charles's hand during harsh Connecticut winters decades ago. Suddenly, I remembered every birthday cake I baked for that boy, every fever I stayed awake beside, every soccer game Charles and I attended sitting on cold aluminum bleachers while cheering louder than anyone else in the crowd. And now my granddaughter was quietly being taught that I belonged outside the center of family life because age supposedly made me fragile and confused. Grandma, Sophie asked gently, are you sad? I forced a soft smile before sitting beside her at the island. No, sweetheart. Just thinking. Sophie studied me carefully for a moment before lowering her voice conspiratorially. Mom gets upset when people ask you things first. My stomach tightened immediately. What kind of things? Holiday stuff? School stuff? Family stuff? Sophie pushed blueberries around her plate thoughtfully. Last week Aunt Rebecca asked you where Christmas dinner should be, and Mom got really quiet in the car afterward. Rebecca was Daniel's cousin from Boston. She still called me first every Thanksgiving asking whether we planned turkey or ham for Christmas Eve. Or at least she used to. What did your mother say? Sophie leaned closer across the counter. She said people need to stop treating you like the boss of everything because it makes moving forward harder. Moving forward. Another one of Vanessa's polished phrases carrying something sharp underneath it. I stared silently at the kitchen cabinets Vanessa repainted white last summer because she claimed the darker wood felt too emotionally heavy. At the time, I almost laughed hearing that explanation. Now I understood she meant something very different. Vanessa believed memory itself was heavy. Traditions were heavy. Emotional attachment was heavy, and the only way she could fully become the center of this family was by making sure everyone slowly viewed my presence as outdated instead of foundational. Sophie suddenly climbed off the stool and ran toward the living room. A few seconds later, she returned carrying an old photo album from the bookshelf near the fireplace. Can we look at these? She asked brightly. My chest softened slightly, seeing the familiar blue album Charles and I filled with family photographs for years before digital pictures replaced printed ones. We sat together at the dining table, turning pages slowly while winter sunlight filled the room around us. Daniel at age 10 holding fishing poles. Beside Charles near Lake George. Family Christmas mornings covered in wrapping paper and cinnamon rolls. Sophie as a newborn sleeping against my shoulder while Vanessa stood beside the hospital bed looking genuinely exhausted but happy. Back then, before all this quiet replacement began, Vanessa still seemed uncertain inside our family. Human. Vulnerable even. Sophie pointed excitedly at one photograph, showing me standing beside a giant Thanksgiving turkey while laughing toward Charles behind the camera. You used to cook everything, she said. I still do sometimes. Sophie shook her head. Not anymore. Mom says she is the one who keeps the family together now. I felt something inside me go completely still. Because children repeat truths adults reveal when they think nobody important is listening. I closed the photo album gently and looked toward the hallway where the old family portraits once hung before Vanessa removed them for cleaner design. Then I finally understood the real danger of what was happening inside this house. Vanessa was not simply changing decorations or seating arrangements or traditions. She was rewriting family memory itself, while everyone else adjusted quietly around her version of reality. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part of all was this. Sophie was beginning to believe those rewritten memories already. The following week, I began noticing things disappearing from the house. Not valuable things. Not objects anyone would report missing immediately. Just pieces of memory quietly removed one by one. The way winter slowly strips leaves from trees until branches stand bare without realizing exactly when the color vanished. First, it was Charles's old record player from the sitting room upstairs. Then several framed photographs disappeared from the hallway beside the laundry room. A week later, I opened the kitchen cabinet searching for the ceramic Christmas mugs Daniel painted for me in elementary school and found sleek white replacements instead. When I asked Vanessa where the older mugs had gone, she smiled softly while arranging flowers near the sink. They looked cluttered, Eleanor. I packed them safely downstairs. Packed. Safely downstairs. Everything sentimental now seemed to belong somewhere hidden away from daily life. One snowy afternoon, while Daniel and Vanessa attended a school fundraiser for Sophie, I decided to organize the basement storage room myself. The basement always smelled faintly of cedar and dust because Charles insisted on lining the shelves with old wooden boards decades ago. I carried a flashlight carefully down the narrow stairs while furnace heat hummed softly through the walls. At first, everything looked ordinary. Holiday decorations stacked neatly. Old winter coats hanging near the back corner. Boxes labeled taxes and donations beside Charles's fishing equipment. Then near the far wall beneath a gray moving blanket, I noticed several large plastic containers I did not recognize. My stomach tightened immediately. Slowly, I pulled the blanket aside. Every container carried identical white labels in Vanessa's neat handwriting. Old family items. Outdated photos. Eleanor's kitchen decor. My hands suddenly felt cold despite the warmth downstairs. I opened the first container carefully. Inside sat years of family history packed away like forgotten clutter. Christmas stockings Charles bought during our first winter married. Handmade ornaments Daniel created as a child. Old cookbooks filled with handwritten recipe notes in my own fading cursive. Another box contained framed photographs removed from the house over recent months. Charles holding newborn Sophie beside the fireplace. Daniel hugging me during his college graduation. Anniversary pictures. Holiday memories. Entire decades of emotional history stacked beneath basement pipes beside unused luggage and old paint cans. I lowered myself slowly onto a folding chair while staring at the boxes around me. Vanessa was not simply redecorating anymore. She was curating which version of this family remained visible upstairs. And somehow, every visible version increasingly centered around her. Then I noticed one final container partially hidden near the back wall. Family room. New display items. I opened it slowly. Inside were brand new framed photographs already prepared for replacement around the house upstairs. Vanessa and Daniel smiling beside the country club Christmas tree. Professional portraits of Vanessa hosting charity events. Family beach photographs where I appeared cropped near the edge or absent entirely. One picture stopped me cold. Vanessa standing at the head of my dining table during Thanksgiving while Sophie and Daniel smiled beside her beneath candlelight. The photograph looked exactly like the kind of image future generations would assume represented the heart of the Whitmore family. And I was nowhere inside it. For several long seconds, the basement around me felt strangely silent except for the furnace clicking softly through the walls. Then suddenly another realization settled painfully into place. Vanessa was not trying to remove me physically from the family first. She was removing me emotionally from the family narrative itself. Because once people disappear from memory, replacing them becomes easy. Footsteps suddenly sounded above me near the basement door. I quickly closed the container just as Vanessa's voice floated downstairs. Eleanor. Calm. Pleasant. Always calm. I stood slowly while dust particles drifted through the flashlight beam around me. Vanessa descended the stairs carefully wearing a camel-colored coat and leather gloves from her afternoon fundraiser downtown. She stopped immediately after seeing the opened containers surrounding me. For one brief moment, genuine irritation crossed her face before disappearing beneath her polished composure. I was wondering where you were, she said lightly. I looked around at the packed boxes surrounding us. You boxed up my life. Vanessa sighed softly like a patient therapist dealing with emotional resistance. I organized storage. You removed family photographs from the walls. The house needed balance. Balance. Such a harmless word for erasure. I stepped closer toward the containers holding decades of memories. Charles built traditions in this family long before you arrived. Vanessa removed one glove slowly before answering. And families cannot survive by worshiping the past forever. Worshiping the past. There it was again. Every memory, every tradition, every emotional attachment framed like weakness instead of loyalty. This is not about decorating, I said quietly. You are trying to replace me. For the first time since entering our family, Vanessa did not immediately deny it. She simply looked at me calmly beneath the dim basement lights while snow tapped softly against the small windows near the ceiling. Eleanor, she finally said, people naturally move toward whoever keeps a family functioning. I stared at her in silence because suddenly I understood something deeply unsettling. Vanessa genuinely believed emotional usefulness determined human value. Love, history, sacrifice, memory. None of those things mattered to her once someone knew or performed the role more efficiently. Then she stepped closer and delivered the sentence that changed everything inside me forever. The truth is, she said softly, most people already see me as the center of this family now. The basement went completely silent after that, and standing there surrounded by boxes containing pieces of my erased life, I realized the cruelest betrayals are not always about money or inheritance. Sometimes the deepest betrayal is watching someone slowly convince your own family that your absence would feel completely natural. After the conversation in the basement, something inside me became very quiet. Not defeated, quiet in the way lakes become still before winter freezes them solid. I stopped arguing with Vanessa after that day. Stopped correcting her when she rewrote family stories during dinners. Stopped reacting when furniture changed or old photographs disappeared from walls upstairs. And strangely, my silence seemed to relax her. Perhaps because people like Vanessa mistake emotional restraint for surrender. They believe calmness means weakness once older women stop fighting openly for space inside their own families. 2 weeks later, the Whitmore house looked almost entirely different from the home Charles and I built together. The downstairs hallway now displayed oversized black and white portraits of Vanessa, hosting charity events beside city officials and smiling elegantly beside Daniel during fundraising galas. The old grandfather clock, Charles restored by hand, no longer stood near the staircase because Vanessa claimed it made the entryway feel too traditional. Even the kitchen smelled different now. Vanilla candles replaced the scent of cinnamon and rosemary that once filled the house naturally during winter evenings. Every room felt polished, expensive, emotionally sterile. One snowy Thursday afternoon, Daniel asked me to sign for a package while he and Vanessa attended another school function for Sophie. The delivery man left several large envelopes beside the front hall table near the staircase. I gathered them carefully, intending only to place them inside Daniel's office. Then I noticed one envelope partially open at the side. Across the front, printed clearly beneath a real estate company logo, were words that made my stomach tighten instantly. Preliminary property evaluation, Whitmore residence. I froze completely. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside sat official appraisal paperwork for the house Charles built with his own hands 40 years earlier. Estimated market value. Suggested renovation upgrades. Potential luxury resale projections after modernization. My pulse began beating harder inside my chest as I turned page after page. Notes in blue ink filled the margins beside certain recommendations. Convert upstairs sitting room into executive office. Remove outdated wood finishes. Expand primary suite once Eleanor relocates. Relocates. Not moves. Not chooses. Relocates. Like furniture. Like storage boxes in the basement. I lowered myself slowly onto the hallway chair near the staircase while cold pressure spread through my chest. Then another folded sheet slipped from inside the envelope onto the floor beside my feet. I picked it up carefully. It was an email printout. Vanessa's name appeared at the top beneath a chain of replies between her and a luxury realtor from Greenwich. The sentence halfway down the page nearly stopped my breathing entirely. Once Eleanor adjusts to assisted living, the emotional resistance around the property should disappear naturally. Emotional resistance. That was what I had become. Not mother. Not widow. Not family. Resistance. I stared at the page while the house around me remained painfully silent except for the faint hum of the heating vents. Another sentence lower on the email tightened something deep inside my chest. Daniel struggles with guilt occasionally, but he understands this transition is necessary for the future we want. future we want. I suddenly realized something horrifying then. Vanessa was not simply planning cosmetic changes or emotional repositioning anymore. She already viewed my removal from this house as inevitable, scheduled, managed, and Daniel knew about all of it. Outside, snow drifted softly across the long driveway where Charles taught Sophie how to ride bicycles years earlier. I remembered him standing there laughing while she wobbled toward the mailbox wearing oversized winter gloves and pink boots. This house carried entire lifetimes inside its walls. Birthdays, illnesses, Christmas mornings, late-night conversations beside fireplaces during storms. Yet somewhere along the way, Vanessa had reduced all of it into square footage and future resale potential. I folded the email carefully and placed everything back inside the envelope just moments before hearing the front door open. Vanessa entered first carrying shopping bags while Daniel followed behind her brushing snow from his coat sleeves. "You are home early," Vanessa said pleasantly. Then she noticed the envelope in my hands. For one brief second, her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "The delivery man asked me to sign," I answered calmly. Daniel stepped forward immediately. "Oh, that is just paperwork. Just paperwork." Strange how betrayal always becomes paperwork once people want to avoid emotional accountability. I looked directly at my son. "You are selling the house." Silence filled the hallway instantly. Vanessa removed her gloves slowly while Daniel looked exhausted before either of them even spoke. Finally, Vanessa answered first. "We are exploring long-term options." Long-term options? Another polished phrase hiding something ruthless underneath it. "An assisted living?" I asked quietly. Daniel finally looked at me then, genuine discomfort flickering across his face. "Mom, nobody finalized anything." But he did not deny it. That hurt more than the paperwork itself. Vanessa stepped closer with calm composure, settling naturally across her face again. "Eleanor, maintaining a property this large eventually becomes unrealistic for someone your age." Someone your age. Not Eleanor Whitmore. Not the woman who spent 40 years building the life inside these walls. Just an aging obstacle requiring management before future renovations could begin. I stared at the staircase behind them where family portraits once hung before Vanessa replaced them with modern photography and neutral artwork. Then I looked back at my son standing silently beside the woman slowly dismantling his own family history room by room. "Charles built this house for us," I said softly. Vanessa's answer came immediately. "And now it needs to evolve beyond grief." Evolve beyond grief. The sentence settled coldly inside my chest because at last I understood the truth completely. Vanessa did not simply want my place at the table. She wanted an entirely new version of the Whitmore family where my existence eventually felt unnecessary to everyone except me. After finding the appraisal documents and the emails about assisted living, I stopped sleeping properly. Not because I feared losing the house anymore. Fear had already passed. What remained now was something colder and sharper than fear. Clarity. I finally understood exactly what Vanessa had been building all these years. Not a family, a transition, a carefully managed replacement where my memories, my traditions, even my emotional presence would eventually disappear so gradually that nobody except me would remember the original version of this home ever existed. But what Vanessa never understood was this. Older women survive things younger people cannot even imagine. We survive childbirth, funerals, betrayals, loneliness, decades of sacrifice no one thanks us for properly. We learn how to remain standing long after the world quietly decides we are no longer useful. And for the first time since Charles died, I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking strategically. The following Monday morning, while Vanessa attended another charity planning meeting and Daniel sat inside his downtown office reviewing contracts, I drove through fresh snowfall toward Richard Bennett's law office near Main Street. Richard handled Whitmore family legal matters for over 30 years. He drafted Charles's will, managed our property records, helped Daniel establish the Whitmore Foundation after college. If anyone understood the emotional history tied to this house, it was Richard. His office still smelled faintly of old books and cedar polish exactly the way it had during Charles's lifetime. "Eleanor," he said warmly once his secretary escorted me inside. "It has been far too long." Richard looked older now, more silver hair, slightly slower movements. But his eyes sharpened instantly the second I explained why I came. I placed the property appraisal papers and Vanessa's printed emails carefully across his desk beneath the afternoon winter light, filtering through tall office windows. Richard read silently for several minutes while the grandfather clock near his bookshelf ticked softly through the room. Finally, he removed his glasses slowly and leaned back in his chair. Charles worried something like this might eventually happen, he said quietly. My chest tightened immediately. What do you mean? Richard folded both hands together thoughtfully. Not specifically about Vanessa, but about influence. Charles always believed family homes carry emotional responsibility, not just financial value. I looked down at the papers spread across the desk between us. Vanessa only sees market value. Richard nodded once. And Daniel? That question hurt more than I expected, because somewhere deep inside me, part of me still hoped my son remained trapped rather than willingly participating. I stared toward the snowy street outside Richard's office window before answering softly. I think Daniel became tired enough to let someone else decide what mattered. Silence settled heavily through the room afterward. Then Richard opened the Whitmore family legal files stored inside a tall cabinet near his desk. Your current estate structure leaves nearly everything directly to Daniel, he explained carefully. The property, foundation oversight, historical assets, investment accounts. Historical assets. Such a formal phrase for entire lifetimes of memory tied to objects people once loved. I want to change it, I said quietly. Richard studied me closely. Are you certain? For a moment, I thought about Sophie coloring snowflakes at the kitchen island. About Charles building sled ramps in the backyard for Daniel during snowstorms. About holiday dinners glowing warmly beneath candlelight long before Vanessa arrived with polished smiles and strategic redesigns. Then I nodded slowly. Yes, I am certain. We spent nearly 4 hours reviewing documents that afternoon. By sunset, everything changed. The Whitmore house would no longer transfer directly into Daniel's control after my death. Instead, the property would enter a protected family trust that prevented sale or structural redesign until Sophie turned 30 years old. Charles's workshop, journals, and original family archives would transfer directly into historical preservation rather than private liquidation. Several investment accounts previously intended for Daniel now funded long-term educational scholarships through the Whitmore Foundation in Charles's name. Daniel would still inherit eventually, but not immediately, not carelessly, and certainly not according to Vanessa's carefully arranged timeline. Do you want me to notify them immediately? Richard asked while organizing the finalized paperwork into folders. I considered the question for a long moment before shaking my head gently. No, I answered calmly. Let them continue believing I know nothing. Because suddenly I understood Vanessa's greatest weakness. Certainty. She genuinely believed older women become passive once emotionally isolated long enough. She mistook silence for surrender the same way emotionally efficient people often do. That evening, snow fell heavily again while I drove home through quiet Connecticut streets glowing beneath Christmas lights and frozen branches. The Whitmore house stood warm against the darkness when I pulled into the driveway, every downstairs window illuminated softly from inside. For decades, arriving home always meant safety to me. Lately, it felt more like returning to a museum where someone else slowly curated which parts of my life deserved display. Inside, I found Daniel alone in the kitchen holding a whiskey glass near the counter while soft jazz played through the speakers Vanessa installed months earlier. He looked exhausted, truly exhausted. Mom, he said quietly, startled seeing me. You were gone a while. I removed my gloves slowly beside the sink. I had errands. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. Vanessa thinks maybe we should all sit down this weekend and talk openly. Talk openly. Interesting phrase considering how long they spent planning my future through emails and hidden paperwork instead of conversations. I looked toward the dining room where Vanessa still sat proudly in my old chair every Sunday evening beneath the chandelier Charles hung himself 40 years earlier. Then I looked back at my son standing alone beneath warm kitchen lights, tired enough now that guilt finally showed openly across his face. That sounds like a good idea, I answered softly. Daniel studied me carefully then, almost unsettled by how calm I sounded. Mom, he asked quietly, are you angry with us? I thought for several seconds before answering honestly. No, Daniel. Anger fades eventually. He swallowed hard. Then what are you feeling? I looked around the kitchen Vanessa redesigned, the family photographs she replaced, the traditions she carefully rewrote piece by piece over years of quiet manipulation. Then I answered with complete calm. Prepared. Sunday dinner arrived beneath another heavy Connecticut snowstorm, the kind Charles used to love because it made the whole world outside feel softer and quieter after dark. Snow drifted steadily across the backyard, while warm yellow light glowed through the Whitmore house windows onto the frozen driveway. Inside, the dining room looked immaculate beneath the chandelier Charles installed himself 38 years earlier. Vanessa had arranged white roses across the center of the oak table and lit expensive candles that smelled faintly of vanilla and cedar. Everything appeared elegant, controlled, perfect. But perfection has a strange way of revealing emotional emptiness once you stop mistaking beauty for warmth. I prepared dinner calmly that afternoon. Pot roast, buttered carrots, homemade rolls. The same recipes Daniel requested every winter growing up. Yet this time, I no longer cooked hoping to preserve peace. I cooked because endings deserve dignity. Vanessa entered the dining room first wearing a cream cashmere sweater and gold earrings reflecting softly beneath the chandelier lights. Daniel followed behind her carrying wine glasses while Sophie rushed ahead excitedly, showing me paper snowflakes from school. For a brief moment watching my granddaughter laugh beside the fireplace, I remembered what this family once felt like before emotional ambition slowly replaced affection. During dinner, conversation remained painfully polite. Sophie talked about her upcoming winter concert, while Daniel barely touched his food, and Vanessa complimented the meal with her usual polished composure. Outside, wind brushed snow against the windows in slow waves while the grandfather clock ticked steadily near the staircase. Nobody mentioned the house. Nobody mentioned assisted living. Nobody mentioned the appraisal documents or the emails discussing my emotional resistance. But tension sat at the table with us anyway, invisible and heavy beneath every sentence. Finally, halfway through dessert, Vanessa folded her napkin carefully beside her plate and smiled toward me. "Eleanor," she said softly, "Daniel and I thought it might help everyone if we discussed future plans openly tonight." Future plans. Such a calm phrase for dismantling someone's entire life. I placed my coffee cup gently onto the saucer before answering. "That sounds reasonable." Daniel looked visibly nervous immediately, almost surprised by how calm I sounded. Vanessa continued smoothly. "We all want what is healthiest emotionally for this family moving forward." Healthiest emotionally. I almost smiled hearing that because emotionally healthy families usually do not hide property appraisals and assisted living plans from widowed mothers. "And what exactly does moving forward look like to you?" I asked quietly. Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with Daniel before speaking again. "The house has become very large for one person to manage comfortably." There it was. The script they rehearsed privately before tonight. Daniel finally forced himself to speak. "Mom, we just think there may be easier living arrangements eventually. Easier, more manageable, less emotional resistance." Every cruel intention wrapped carefully inside polite language so nobody needed to feel guilty about what they were really doing. I looked slowly around the dining room, while candlelight flickered across the oak table Charles built by hand during the winter Daniel turned 12. The same table where birthdays, grief, holidays, laughter, illnesses, and decades of ordinary family love once gathered naturally together. Then I looked directly at Vanessa. "You already planned everything months ago." Silence fell instantly across the room. Sophie looked nervously between us, while Daniel's face lost color almost immediately. Vanessa remained composed for only a few seconds longer before her smile tightened slightly. "Eleanor, nobody planned anything behind your back." I reached calmly beside my chair and placed a thick folder onto the table between us. Richard Bennett's finalized legal documents rested neatly inside beneath the chandelier light. Daniel stared at the folder instantly. Vanessa did not move at all. "I met with Richard last week," I said softly. "The Whitmore estate has been restructured." Daniel blinked slowly. "Restructured?" I nodded once. "The house now belongs to a protected family trust. It cannot be sold, renovated, or transferred outside the Whitmore family until Sophie turns 30. Complete silence followed those words. Even the storm outside seemed quieter somehow. Vanessa's composure finally cracked then, only slightly, but enough. "You changed the estate without discussing it with us?" she asked carefully. Carefully, because anger would reveal too much too quickly. You discussed selling my home without discussing it with me first, I answered calmly. Daniel opened the folder slowly, scanning pages while tension spread visibly across his face. Mom, he whispered hoarsely. The workshop and historical archives are now preserved permanently through the Whitmore Foundation, I continued quietly. Several investment accounts were redirected into scholarship trusts in Charles's name. Vanessa finally stopped pretending entirely. This is emotional retaliation, she said sharply. I looked directly at her across the candlelight, while snow battered the windows behind us. No, Vanessa. This is protection. The room remained frozen in silence afterward. Sophie stared quietly at her untouched pie while Daniel rubbed both hands across his face like a man suddenly realizing how much damage accumulated while he avoided conflict for too long. Finally, he looked up at me with genuine heartbreak in his eyes. Mom, he whispered, I never wanted you to feel replaced. My chest tightened painfully hearing that because deep down, I believed him. Daniel never became cruel intentionally. He simply allowed someone else to slowly redefine loyalty until comfort mattered more than memory. Vanessa stood abruptly from the table then, frustration finally visible beneath years of polished restraint. You cannot keep this family trapped inside the past forever, she said coldly. I remained seated calmly beneath the chandelier while looking around the room one final time. Charles's photographs. Sophie's paper snowflakes near the fireplace. The old grandfather clock still ticking despite everything Vanessa tried removing from this house over the years. Then I looked back at her. No, I answered softly. But families who erase their past usually lose themselves completely. Vanessa stared at me silently for several long seconds before turning away toward the kitchen without another word. Daniel remained seated motionless beside the legal documents while guilt, exhaustion, and grief finally settled openly across his face at last. And sitting there beneath warm candlelight while snow buried the Connecticut streets outside, I realized something heartbreaking but true. Vanessa never really wanted my son alone. She wanted the emotional throne built through decades of sacrifice, memory, and unconditional love. But the tragic thing about replacing a mother is this. You can imitate her routines. You can occupy her chair. You can even convince people to forget her temporarily. But you can never truly recreate the history that made her irreplaceable in the first place.